Part 1. The Phantom of Power. Edward V and the Tower's Shadow. Scene opens with thick fog crawling over the River Thames. The Tower of London looms in the background. Slow choral music echoes. Narrator V.O. In London's heart stands a building that once dictated the fate of kings and traitors. The Tower of London is not just a fortress, it's a vault of secrets. And among those secrets, one story casts a darker shadow than the rest: the mysterious vanishing of two royal boys, one of whom was England's rightful king. Cut to close-up engraving of Edward IV's face. Narrator: he was only 12. A boy, not yet crowned, not yet ruling. His name Edward Feast. But history remembers him not for his reign, but for his disappearance. And beside him, his younger brother Richard of Shrewsbury. Together they would become symbols of innocence, extinguished by ambition. The setting: England in turmoil. To understand what happened to Edward V, we need to step back into the bloody chessboard of English history, the Wars of the Roses. This wasn't just a civil war. It was a generational blood feud between two branches of the Plantagenet family, the Lancasters and the Yorks, over who had the right to rule England. Visual overlay: family trees of Lancaster and York intertwining. After years of battles, betrayals, and beheadings, the Yorkist Edward IV had finally taken control. Strong in war, charismatic in court, Edward was everything a medieval king should be. But behind the scenes, he made enemies, and when he died unexpectedly at age 40 in April 1483, he left behind a crown in the hands of a child and a kingdom in the hands of wolves. Edward V, a king in name only. Edward IV was born into power, but also into peril. From birth, his destiny was written in gold. But no child, no matter how royal, could survive the political storm that awaited him. At the time of his father's death, Edward was only 12, living safely in Ludlow Castle with his maternal family, the Woodvilles. He was intelligent, well-educated, and even fluent in French and Latin. But wisdom couldn't protect him from ambition. Cut to reenactment: Edward receiving news of his father's death, shock and confusion on his face. Narrator: it was April 9th, 1483. The boy was told, "You are now King of England." But in truth, his fate was sealed not by a crown, but by who would claim guardianship of it. Political players, the stage of power. Let's pause here and map out the key players. Elizabeth Woodville, the Queen Mother. A former commoner, fiercely protective of her children, but despised by many nobles for her family's sudden rise to power. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, Edward IV's younger brother. A loyal servant until he wasn't. Appointed as Lord Protector by Edward IV's will. The Woodville faction, including Lord Rivers, Edward's uncle, and Sir Richard Grey, his half-brother who sought to dominate the young king's council. The Council of Nobles, a mixture of loyalists, opportunists, and survivors, each with personal stakes in the game. Commentary: this wasn't just politics, it was a brutal zero-sum game. Medieval England didn't tolerate divided authority. Either you ruled or you were eliminated. The crisis ignites who holds the king. Narrator: upon Edward IV's death, the Woodvilles moved quickly. They wanted Edward V crowned immediately, thinking speed would help them control the boy and marginalize Richard, Duke of Gloucester. But Richard wasn't going to be sidelined. On April 29, 1483, Richard met Edward's traveling party at Stony Stratford. With a display of calm authority, he arrested Lord Rivers and Sir Richard Grey, two of the boy's closest family members, and took custody of Edward V himself. Dramatic reenactment: Richard appearing with soldiers. The boy Edward watches helplessly as his uncle arrests his protectors. Narrator: to many it looked like a rescue. To others it was the first step of a royal abduction. The Tower of London, royal palace, or death trap? When Richard brought Edward to London, he lodged the boy in the Tower of London. This wasn't unusual at the time. The Tower functioned as both royal residence and state prison. Kings often stayed there before their coronations. Cut to interior of the tower: narrow corridors, iron-bound doors, echoes of footsteps. But this time, the coronation kept being delayed. And as the days passed, fewer and fewer people were allowed to see the young king. Commentary: this is where things get ominous. Imagine being 12. You've lost your father. Your trusted guardians are arrested. You're now locked away in a fortress run by a man who stands to gain everything if you disappear. The parallels to hostage scenarios in modern history are chilling. Think of overthrown leaders confined before being executed. What makes Edward V's story worse is that it wasn't clear he was even considered a prisoner. Elizabeth Woodville. A mother in hiding, while Edward V was locked in the Tower, his mother fled to Westminster Abbey with her younger children invoking sanctuary rights. She knew what was coming. Still, she was pressured into releasing her second son, Richard, Duke of York, so he could join his brother in preparation for the coronation. On June 16, 1483, the second prince was taken to the Tower. Narrator: from this moment on, both boys were locked away together. The last recorded sighting of them as free individuals. Personal reflection. The innocence of the unseen. There's something haunting about the mental image. Two boys barely old enough to understand inheritance or betrayal, pacing the halls of a fortress they believed was a palace. Perhaps they waited for robes and trumpets. Perhaps they asked why their coronation kept being postponed. Maybe they stopped asking altogether. Visual: empty tower room. Child's shoe abandoned near the stone wall. Light from a barred window slowly dims. Their story is not only about a crime, it's about the silence that followed, the chilling absence of justice, of closure. We don't have the luxury of knowing what their final days look like. All we know is that they vanished and that the man who was supposed to protect them was crowned instead. Analysis: Richard's intentions. Let's not jump to conclusions just yet. At this stage, some historians argue Richard may have still intended to rule only as protector. The Woodville faction was powerful and dangerous, and Richard's initial moves could be interpreted as necessary for securing stability. After all, medieval guardianships often involved political arrests. Even executions weren't uncommon. But the shift came quickly. Within weeks of assuming the role of protector, Richard executed Lord Hastings, a trusted advisor of Edward IV, without trial. Then a sermon declared the princes illegitimate. Narrator: the stage was set not for a coronation, but for a usurpation. Closing section of Part 1. The Crown, the Chessboard, and the Child. What does this story tell us so far? It tells us that the crown was never safe on a child's head, that political ambition doesn't wait, it acts, it kills. Edward V's short-lived title wasn't a shield, it was a target, and the Tower of London, meant to host his coronation, would instead become his tomb. Scene ends with the silhouette of two children holding hands fading into shadow as the tower gates close. Narrator: softly in the Tower of London, a crown waited, but no king came. Part 2. The legal execution of a crown, from protector to king. Scene opens, cathedral bells ring over London. People gather in a square as rumors swirl. Narrator: VO. By midsummer of 1483, England stood on the edge of transformation. The boy king remained in the Tower. The public waited for his coronation, but instead what they got was a chilling silence, and then a sermon that shattered the very foundation of his claim to the throne. The turning point: Lord Hastings' execution. Let's revisit one of the most telling events in this dark narrative. On June 13, 1483, Richard called a seemingly ordinary meeting of the Royal Council. But by the end of the session, one of Edward IV's most loyal advisors, Lord William Hastings, lay dead, executed without trial inside the Tower. Why? Richard accused Hastings of treason. Allegedly, he was conspiring with the Woodvilles to remove Richard from his role as protector. But the truth may be far murkier. Commentary: this wasn't justice, it was a demonstration. By eliminating Hastings, Richard silenced a major Yorkist loyalist who might have blocked his path to the throne. Reenactment scene. Hastings dragged out, sword flashing. Shocked nobles look on. Narrator: this was the first overt sign that Richard's loyalty to his nephew had expired, and London noticed. Titulus Regius law as a weapon. A few weeks later, Richard's allies presented a sermon that changed the game entirely. Delivered at St. Paul's Cross, the sermon alleged that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had been invalid. Why? Because Edward had supposedly been pre-contracted to Lady Eleanor Butler, a noblewoman who had since died. If that allegation held, all children from the Woodville marriage were illegitimate, including Edward Theophorm and his brother. Narrator: it wasn't just character assassination, it was legal assassination. Shortly afterward, a formal petition emerged, ostensibly from a group of nobles and citizens, requesting Richard to take the crown. It's unknown how genuine this petition was, or how much it was orchestrated behind the scenes. On June 26, 1483, Richard accepted. By July 6th, he was crowned King Richard III, Shakespeare's shadow myth and propaganda. Much of what the public knows about Richard III comes from Shakespeare's famous tragedy, a deformed villainous usurper who manipulates, kills, and lies his way to power. And thus I clothe my naked villainy, Richard III, actor scene 30. But how accurate is this portrayal? Let's pause and evaluate. Shakespeare wrote during the reign of the Tudors, specifically Elizabeth I. His patrons were descendants of the very people who benefited from Richard's downfall. The play was political propaganda meant to justify the legitimacy of the Tudor dynasty. Commentary. While Richard III may have been ruthless, the extent of his villainy is historically questionable. Many actions attributed to him, like the murder of the princes, are based on sources written decades later during Tudor rule. In fact, contemporary accounts describe Richard as just fair and deeply religious traits rarely shown in dramatic retellings. Modern historical analysis. A shifting reputation. In recent years, scholars have begun to reassess Richard III. Some have argued he was more reformer than tyrant. He implemented legal reforms that protected the rights of the poor and tried to make the English court system more equitable. So why the drastic change of heart? Because once he became king, Edward V became a threat. As long as the boy and his brother lived, Richard's claim would be questioned. Civil war remained a real possibility. In the medieval world, power was not inherited peacefully. It was seized, justified, and defended. Real-world parallel. This situation isn't unique to medieval England. Consider Julius Caesar's assassination in ancient Rome, or the forced abdication of Emperor Puyi in China. Young rulers, especially those surrounded by ambitious advisors, often fell victim to the very system meant to protect them. The princes disappear now that Richard had the crown, all eyes turned back to the Tower. Throughout July 1483, the young princes were occasionally seen playing in the royal gardens. Visitors reported glimpses of the boys from the windows. But by late summer, those sightings stopped. No official statement was issued. No public announcement. Just silence. And with that silence came rumors. Narrator. Had they been killed, moved, hidden? Were they sick? The court offered no answers, and so the people began to draw their own. Speculation, rumors, and fear. Some claimed they had been smothered with pillows in the dead of night, murdered quietly, efficiently. Others whispered that they were starved in a hidden dungeon. The most chilling theory, that Richard had personally ordered the murder of both boys to eliminate all rivals. But here's where things get even murkier. There are no contemporary records of the boys' deaths. No graves, no witnesses, and no documents have ever conclusively proven their fate. The story of their murder comes from Sir Thomas More's writings penned decades later during Tudor rule. Narrator More's account names the assassins, details the method, and describes the burial. But he was a child at the time of the events and wrote under a monarchy that despised Richard III. Commentary. It's like learning about Richard Nixon solely from Watergate headlines. We miss the nuance, the uncertainty, and the possible distortions. Closing thoughts for Part 2. By the end of summer 1483, Edward V was gone not only from the public eye, but from the historical record. A king in name, only erased without coronation, without funeral, without justice. Narrator history records his birth and his disappearance, but everything in between has been blurred by time, politics, and fear, and his younger brother Richard, just 9 years old, vanished alongside him. In the next part of our story, we'll explore the theories of their fate, the ghosts of guilt that haunted England, and the pretenders and claimants who would rise in their names. Part 3, Whispers in the Tower. Theories, confessions, and the vanishing of Edward V. Opening scene, dimly lit tower staircase. Wind howls through cracks in the stone. The camera pans slowly down to where a small wooden box is hidden beneath rubble. Narrator VO. By the fall of 1483, the voices of 2 royal children had faded. They were no longer seen in the gardens. Their names were no longer spoken at court. They had simply vanished, but silence breeds suspicion, and soon rumors filled the void left by their absence. The most popular theory, suffocation by pillow. The most well-known version of events, one immortalized by William Shakespeare and Sir Thomas More, describes a chilling execution. The boys are asleep in the tower. A messenger named John Green delivers Richard III's secret orders. The constable of the tower, Robert Brackenbury, allegedly refuses to kill the boys himself. So James Tyrrell, a loyal knight, is given the keys to the tower for one night. He hires two assassins, Miles Forrest and John Dighton. The boys are smothered with pillows, then buried under a staircase. Narrator. It's a compelling narrative, simple, tragic, and clean, but it's also full of problems. Sir Thomas More, hero or historical fictionist. Sir Thomas More's account is the primary source for this version. Written nearly 40 years after the events, his story paints Richard III as a monstrous tyrant. But we need to ask, how reliable was More's analysis? He was 5 years old at the time of the disappearance. He wrote during the reign of Henry VIII, son of Henry Tudor, the man who defeated Richard III. His version relied on hearsay and second-hand rumors, not eyewitness testimony. The confession by Tyrrell was extracted under torture, hardly reliable. Commentary. Imagine building a criminal case today based entirely on a coerced confession and a story written decades later by someone with political incentives. That's the foundation of the smothering theory. Discovery of the bones. Now 1674, fast forward to the year 1674. Workers renovating the Tower of London's White Tower discovered a wooden chest buried beneath a staircase. Inside were the bones of two children. King Charles II, believing them to be the missing princes, ordered their remains reburied in Westminster Abbey under a plaque identifying them as Edward V and Richard, Duke of York. Visual Westminster Abbey tomb of the princes in the tower. So case closed, not quite. Scientific limitations and controversies. In 1933, the bones were examined by anatomists. Their conclusion: the remains likely belonged to two boys of the right age, but the methods were primitive by today's standards. No DNA tests, no isotope analysis, no conclusive dating. Even more frustrating, since then, requests for modern DNA testing have been rejected by the royal family and the Church of England. Narrator. The Crown doesn't want ghosts stirred, but historians want closure. Real-world comparison. In 2012, the bones of Richard III himself were discovered under a parking lot in Leicester and confirmed via mitochondrial DNA. If we can do that for a centuries-old monarch, why not test the bones of two missing children whose fate shaped a dynasty? Who had the motive? Let's break down the possible suspects. 1. Richard III motive. The boys were a direct threat to his throne. As long as they lived, they could be used to stage rebellions. Opportunity. As King and Lord Protector, he had absolute access to the tower and control of its staff. Behavior. After their disappearance, he never addressed their fate. He made no announcement, no denial, no acknowledgement. Counterpoint. If he killed them, why didn't he blame disease or fabricate an accidental death to avoid suspicion? Narrator. It's possible he didn't want martyrdom. Perhaps silence was his way of erasing them physically and politically. But you too, the Duke of Buckingham. Once a trusted ally of Richard Buckingham, later turned against him in a failed revolt. Motive. By eliminating the princes, he might force Richard to lose favor and pave the way for his own ambitions. Evidence. A Portuguese document from the Times suggests Richard entrusted the princes to Buckingham, and under his watch they died of neglect or starvation. Weakness. Buckingham's rebellion failed and he was executed. If he'd killed the princes, he gained nothing from it. 3. Henry Tudor. Henry the 9th. Motive. As a distant Lancastrian claimant, he benefited immensely from their deaths. With Edward V gone, his claim was stronger. Opportunity. He was in exile during the disappearance, but could have had agents in England. Behavior. After becoming King, Henry made no attempt to investigate the disappearance. Instead, he quickly married Elizabeth of York, sister of the missing princes, uniting the warring families and ending the Wars of the Roses. Commentary. Silence from Richard is suspicious, but silence from Henry, who had every reason to seek justice, may be even more telling. The Pretenders. Was Richard alive? During Henry VII's reign, a man named Perkin Warbeck claimed to be Richard, Duke of York, one of the two lost princes. He claimed he escaped the tower, fled abroad, and returned to reclaim his place. Warbeck was ultimately captured and executed in 1499. Most historians believe he was an imposter. But in 2004, historian Philippa Langley discovered documents suggesting Richard might have been smuggled out by Yorkist sympathizers. One of the documents a first-person account describing the escape route, the ship and arrival in Portugal. Narrator. It's possible that one prince lived and that the mystery isn't murder, but exile. Wrapping Part 3, Ghosts of Truth. Visual candlelit hallway in the tower. Two shadows appear at the end, small and silent. Narrator softly. For centuries, the tower has been a place of power, but also pain. And among its many ghosts, the most tragic may be two boys who never got the chance to grow up. Whether they were murdered, hidden, or erased, we may never know. But their story continues to haunt every stone of this fortress. And the truth, it may still lie beneath it. Part 4, The King Who Fell in Battle. Richard III in the Rise of the Tudors. Opening shot, battlefield at dawn. Fog lingers over broken weapons and fallen soldiers. The silhouette of a crown lies in the mud. Narrator VO. In the end, it wasn't a pillow or a whispered conspiracy that brought Richard III down. It was steel cold, blunt, and unforgiving. On a field in Leicestershire, England's last Plantagenet king met his end not in a palace, but in the blood-soaked chaos of war. The Battle of Bosworth Field, August 22, 1480. After seizing the crown in 1483, Richard III's reign lasted just over 2 years, but they were anything but peaceful. Discontent brewed beneath the surface. The Woodville faction had been humiliated. Rumors of the prince's deaths had turned many against him. The Duke of Buckingham had rebelled and been executed. A distant exile named Henry Tudor prepared to return. On August 22, 1485, the armies of Richard III and Henry Tudor clashed near the village of Bosworth. Outnumbered, Richard made a bold move. He charged directly at Henry's position, aiming to end the rebellion with a single strike. Reenactment. Richard on horseback cutting down enemy soldiers aiming for Henry. He's surrounded, dragged down, killed. Narrator. He came within a sword's reach of changing history, but it wasn't enough. Richard was killed in the chaos. His crown, reportedly found tangled in a thorn bush, was placed on Henry's head that same day. Henry VII, the king who needed a myth with Richard gone. Henry Tudor became King Henry VII, founder of the Tudor dynasty. He wasted no time rewriting the narrative. The best way to legitimize his reign, make Richard the monster and the lost princes the martyr victims of his evil. Actions taken. Henry outlawed Titulus Regius, the act that had declared Edward IV's children illegitimate. He married Elizabeth of York, sister of the missing princes, uniting the Lancasters and Yorks. He ensured that any questioning of his claim was met with suspicion or execution. Commentary. Henry's reign depended on erasing doubt. He didn't just defeat Richard, he buried him beneath layers of disgrace, and in doing so he ensured the princes would become symbols, not just victims. Propaganda and performance. Enter William Shakespeare. Writing under Elizabeth, Henry VII's granddaughter Shakespeare penned Richard III, a play that turned the late king into a hunchback, child-murdering, power-obsessed demon. Quotes like, "I am determined to prove a villain," cemented Richard's image for generations. But the problem, Shakespeare wasn't a historian. He was a playwright working under a Tudor queen. His job wasn't to tell the truth. It was to entertain and legitimize the dynasty. Narrator. And for 400 years he succeeded. Richard III's name became synonymous with evil, so much so that his remains would stay missing until the 21st century. The lost body of a king. Richard's death was brutal. He was hacked down, likely struck in the skull, and stabbed in the back, consistent with medieval descriptions of his demise. But after the battle, his body was stripped, humiliated, and buried hastily at Greyfriars Church in Leicester, a site that would be forgotten for over 5 centuries, until 2012. Footage of the archaeological dig under the parking lot in Leicester. A team led by Philippa Langley discovered a skeleton beneath a modern parking lot. DNA testing confirmed it the remains of Richard III. Commentary. Ironically, Richard was the one surrounded by myths, but he became the first English monarch identified by modern science. The mystery that refuses to die. Let's pause and reflect. Why does the disappearance of Edward IV and his brother still matter? Why do we care? Because it's not just about two boys. It's about how power treats innocence. It's about how history is written, shaped, and weaponized. And it's about the uncomfortable truth that justice isn't always part of the royal process. Narrator. The Tower of London still stands. The throne still exists, but the bones of two young boys presumed kings are still cloaked in uncertainty. Lessons from Part 4. 1. History is always political. The victors shape the past to serve the present. Richard III may have been guilty, but our understanding of him was filtered through the needs of those who overthrew him. 2. Silence is a strategy. Both Richard and Henry used silence as a weapon. Richard never explained the prince's fate. Henry never demanded justice for them. That silence allowed myths to fill the void. 3. Symbols matter. Edward V's death may have ended his claim, but it gave rise to centuries of debate, fear fiction, and ghost stories. In a way, he rules history far longer than if he'd lived. Visual Tower of London at night. A light flickers in one window. Distant echo of children laughing or crying. Narrator whisper, "In a kingdom built on inheritance, justice, and war. What became of the boy who never wore the crown? The answers may still lie beneath the tower, or within us." Echoes in the stone. Ghost legends and the cultural haunting of Edward V. Opening scene. A tourist walks through the Tower of London at dusk. The sky is turning purple. A raven croaks from a perch above. The guide's voice lowers to a whisper. Tour guide Vio. They say if you come here late enough, you might still hear them. Two boys with barefoot dressed in white, sometimes laughing, sometimes weeping, and always holding hands. Camera pans toward a dark corridor where two faint child-sized figures seem to vanish. The tower's most haunted legend. The Tower of London is full of ghosts. Anne Boleyn Headless walks near the chapel where she was executed. Arbella Stewart, cousin to Elizabeth Amherst, is said to pace her old prison quarters. But none haunt the human imagination like Edward VI and his younger brother Richard, Duke of York. Reported sightings over the years. Guards in the 15th and 16th centuries spoke of seeing two boys in nightgowns clinging to each other in fear. Victorian-era tourists reported feeling watched in the tower rooms where the princes were held. Some claimed to see small footprints appear mysteriously in the dust along the stairs. Narrator. The mystery didn't end with the bones. It began with them. Why do we see ghosts? Let's step back. Why do ghost stories emerge around tragic deaths, especially unsolved royal ones? Psychological theory. Humans are pattern-seeking creatures. When closure is denied, when justice is absent, our minds create symbols to process trauma. Ghosts are manifestations of unresolved grief and guilt. Historical parallel. Consider the Romanovs of Russia. When Nicholas II and his family were murdered in 1918, stories spread that Anastasia had survived. Movies were made. Books were written. In truth, they were all executed. Narrator. But we needed her to survive, just like we need Edward and Richard to haunt us. The princes in fiction and folklore. For more than 5 centuries, the lost princes have reappeared in poems, novels, dramas, and documentaries. Famous retellings, Shakespeare's Richard III, cemented Richard's role as their killer. Mark Twain's The Prince and the Pauper, inspired by Edward's brief, powerless kingship. Josephine Tey's The Daughter of Time, a detective novel that re-examines the case and suggests Richard III was innocent. Philippa Gregory's The White Queen, a dramatized take on the Woodville perspective, portraying Elizabeth as a grieving mother who suspects Richard. Commentary. These retellings reveal more about the eras they were written in than the historical event itself. Each generation projects its own fears, values, and questions onto the vanished princes. Symbolism. The princes as martyrs. The disappearance of Edward V and his brother transcended tragedy. It became a parable. They represent innocence betrayed by ambition, youth swallowed by war, justice lost to silence, and perhaps most powerfully, the cost of monarchy's dark side. The princes versus the crown. The crown should represent order, continuity, and sacred duty. But the death of these boys reminds us that in reality, the crown has often been won through betrayal, murder, and lies. Real-life echoes. The suspicious death of Prince Albert Victor, heir to Queen Victoria, whose sudden demise led to conspiracy theories. The fatal crash of Princess Diana, and the public suspicion that followed. Even in modern democracies, political dynasties often collapse under pressure or scandal when power is poorly transferred. Narrator. When children die because of politics, their innocence isn't just lost, it's weaponized. Edward and Richard became myths because the truth was too heavy to carry. Art, film, and memory. The princes have been depicted in countless works of art. John Everett Millet's painting shows the boys waiting anxiously in the Tower Garden. It's one of the most haunting Victorian images of lost youth. British stage plays and historical dramas often use child actors in white costumes, reinforcing their role as ghosts of the realm. Modern documentaries frequently begin with the question, what happened to the princes in the tower, but rarely offer a definitive answer. Narrator, because the mystery itself has become the story. Why this story endures. Let's get to the heart of it. Why has this case lasted over 500 years? 1. Lack of closure. No trial, no confirmed burial, no accepted killer, just disappearance. That breeds legend. 2. Royal obsession. We are fascinated by royalty, not just their power, but their pain. Tragedy among kings feels Shakespearean by nature. 3. Moral mirror. The story forces us to ask, would we protect the innocent or would we remain silent like so many did? 4. Perpetual relevance. Every generation has its missing prince, whether literal or metaphorical, whether it's a truth covered up or a youth betrayed by the system. The children who became questions, Edward V never ruled. He never led troops, issued proclamations, or passed laws, but he outlasted kings in memory. His story alongside his brothers is less about what they did and more about what was done to them, and what we still don't know. Narrator. Even in the age of DNA satellite imaging and forensic archives, we're no closer to the truth than they were in 1483. The Tower of London still holds its secrets, and we still listen for footsteps in the dark. Summer Part 6, The Crownless King. Truth, legacy, and lessons from the Tower. Opening scene, bird's eye view of the Tower of London at dawn. The city breathes awake as light creeps over the fortress's ancient stones. Narrator, VO. Centuries have passed. Kings and queens have risen and fallen. London has changed. But inside the tower, one silence remains unbroken. The mystery of Edward V. What happened to the boy king? And what, if anything, can we learn from a question that still has no answer? Reviewing the final theories. Let's bring everything together. Over the past 5 parts, we've explored the disappearance, the suspects, the symbolism, and the legacy. Now we return to the question that's haunted England for 500 years. Who killed the princes in the tower? Theory 1, Richard III ordered their murder. Motive, clear succession threat. Means access to tower and personnel. Behavior, no denial, no official statement, no burial. Weakness. Lack of direct evidence and suspicion over why he didn't fake an accidental death. Rebuttal. If Richard killed them, wouldn't he have removed the suspicion with a false public story? Theory 2. The Duke of Buckingham went rogue. Motive, power, ambitions, and possible rivalry with Richard. Means rumored to have had custody. Support, Portuguese reports and speculation that he acted without Richard's knowledge. Weakness. He gained no political benefit and died shortly after rebelling. Theory 3. Henry Tudor. Henry VII was behind it. Motive, needed the princes gone to solidify claim. Means had agents in England even before 1485. Behavior, never investigated, never exhumed bodies, never punished anyone. Commentary, Henry had more reason to erase their memory than to avenge them. His silence is damning in a different way. Theory 4. At least one prince escaped. Richard of Shrewsbury, as Perkin Warbeck appears in later years claiming to be the younger prince. Philippa Langley's research indicates possible Yorkist rescue and escape to Portugal. Evidence sparse, mostly circumstantial, but compelling enough to keep the debate alive. The limits of evidence. Here's the truth, no theory is airtight. Every version has gaps, either in timeline, motivation, or evidence. The bones found in the tower could be the boys, but we won't know without DNA testing, which the monarchy and the church have refused. Why? Fear of results that change historical narratives, fear of proving the wrong theory, or simply fear of disturbing the myth. Narrator. And sometimes myths are more comfortable than facts. The modern impact of an old mystery. Why should you care about Edward V? Because his story isn't just a medieval whodunit. It's a reminder of how vulnerable truth is, especially when it threatens power. This case teaches us. Lesson 1. Power is built on control, including of memory. Richard tried to control the throne by possibly removing the heirs. Henry VII controlled history by silencing questions. Shakespeare cemented the narrative by dramatizing one version. We've inherited not the truth, but a curated memory. Lesson 2. Justice delayed can become justice denied. If the bones are real, they've been buried wrongly for over 3 centuries. If the wrong person was blamed, history has been slandering them unjustly. And if the truth was never told, then England crowned a King Richard III without ever asking what it cost. Lesson 3. We romanticize the innocent dead. Edward V never made mistakes. He never ruled. That makes him the perfect tragic figure, a clean canvas for guilt, honor, and lost hope. His silence lets others speak for him, which is what power often wants from those it silences. The final resting place. Scene: Westminster Abbey, dim lighting. The tomb bearing the names Edward and Richard glows faintly under spotlights. This is where many believe the boys rest. But we don't know for sure. Until the church allows DNA analysis, doubt reigns. And maybe that's why the story persists. Because doubt is more powerful than certainty. It keeps us coming back. It haunts us. The universal story. Take away the crowns, the robes, and the throne, and what are you left with? 2 children, removed from their home, abandoned by the state, possibly betrayed by their own blood. Their story is the story of any innocent caught in the gears of power. It's about what happens when loyalty dies and silence wins. Narrator. We are drawn to them not because they ruled, but because they were ruled over and then discarded. Final reflection. The boy who never became King Edward, I's legacy doesn't lie in deeds or victories. It lies in the questions he left behind. What does it mean to inherit power but never exercise it? What is justice when time makes everyone innocent? And what do we owe the dead, especially those whose story still shapes the living? Closing narration. Scene fades to black. A child's voice echoes softly. Voice VO. We were just playing. We didn't know. A final image of 2 boys hand in hand, walking down a corridor of light. One turns back and looks toward the viewer. Fade to white. Narrator, soft calm. They vanished into stone, but not into silence. The tower holds many ghosts, but none more enduring than a crown that was never worn. Edward V, the boy who should have been king, and the mystery that made him immortal.